Welcome to the Doom Scroll News Report here on Radio Taiwan International, where I, Hannah Belinsky, and my co-host, Amanda Stevens,
hello,
two writers, political by necessity, cover some of the biggest international news stories dominating our news feeds from the last week. We are tackling the latest news out of Canada this week, particularly the results of their elections and how squabbles with their neighbor swayed those results, in addition to the 145% tariff that very neighbor has slapped on China. Quite a Trump-themed episode, if I'm being perfectly honest.
Yeah, I mean, so in surprising ways. We are always... For the record, we only have 3 episodes here, but we are always trying to reach out beyond just our smaller scope and our home roots to other stories. And it's kind of hard for us to find things that don't currently seem to be touched, at least in our news spheres, by the tentacles or tendrils of the current administration.
The tendrils.
It's like the image I have in my head of like creeping tendrils.
That's one good thing, I guess, about Trump is there is technically always something to talk about in the news since, you know, he's always up to something pretty crazy.
Kind of the silver lining on a turd.
Yeah, exactly. Why do I feel like we're going to use that phrase a lot?
A lot.
So I want to kick things off today talking about Canada.
Another election.
Yes, who for these two American hosts is our good old neighbor up north. Personally, I've never held a grudge against any Canadians. I'm a big fan of Ryan Gosling, who is Canadian, fun fact. But U.S. President Donald Trump's rhetoric, as of late, has made international relations on the North American continent rather frigid. This week, the big news is that Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney has won their Liberal Party's 4th consecutive election.
Insane.
Yes, so reading an article by Neil Moss, Irem Koca, I hope I'm not butchering that, and Eleanor Wang, reporting for the Hill Times, a Canadian source, the election campaign lasted about 6 weeks against the backdrop of Trump's tariffs on Canadian imports, as well as his constantly talking about how he's going to make Canada the 51st state. Carney campaigned on keeping Canada a strong, sovereign nation in spite of whatever Trump may say, and anxious and irritated Canadians responded to that. Yeah. So what's really interesting about the result is that their Conservative Party was expected to win this election largely on the basis of just how sick of Justin Trudeau and the Liberal Party most Canadians had gotten. They had just gotten tired of him. Trudeau had been the Liberal Party's sweetheart back in 2015, but a series of ethics scandals involving his government sullied his image, and Canadian voters made it clear over the past summer that they had soured on Trudeau. Stepping down as prime minister on January 6th turned out to be one of the best things he could do for his party, which, at the time of his resignation, languished about 25 points behind Conservatives. And Carney, appearing on the scene, really did a lot to revitalize support. I have to confess, I had to do a lot of homework for this particular topic because I don't stay nearly as up to date on Canadian news and politics. Do you keep up much with Canada?
Well, to be honest, I think I keep up a little bit more than most people because this is going to be relevant in both of the articles we're talking about today. I'm from Seattle, which is very
close,
northwest, very close. And so I visited Canada a lot. And a lot of Canadians used to come and visit us because we're so close. Even my college town was like 20 minutes away. So our economies were very intertwined, and especially like the outdoor sport economy, because there's mountains and places like you just want to travel all around. We had special agreements between like our state and the Canadian province just north of us, British Columbia. So it has been in my interest to keep abreast of like some of the most viral Canadian stories. I don't know. Like I'm not really up to date on
the big stuff.
I'm up to date on some of the big stuff.
Right.
Not really on like the smaller minutiae or like the intercity problems. But
I see.
So yeah, I was kind of tracking this. I found it notable that when I was trying to think of when this thing was like upcoming, the election, I couldn't remember the name of any of the prime ministers before Trudeau.
Oh, yeah.
He's been the only one that I've known.
Same.
Like,
Same.
I know I did used to know the name of the previous prime minister, and I don't even remember it, but I was curious to see where this election would go because I double-checked. You said he was in 2015.
Yeah.
Crazy to me to imagine a president in charge or one political party in charge for 10 years.
Yeah.
A decade. And now even more than that. But so for this, I was talking to one of my friends here who is Canadian to just get more details on like the election. And I found it interesting as an American that in Canada they have like 4 major parties, right?
Right. Okay.
And usually it's not like American elections where it's like very polarized.
Right.
This election was. It was really polarized. And that was very interesting to me. I didn't expect Mark Carney to, I don't know that I didn't expect it, but I wasn't sure if he was going to win, because I think one thing that at least Canadian and American politics have in common is that when an election happens, and when one party has been in charge for a long time, the people tend to look for somebody who is in at least some ways the opposite of the previous leader.
I think the same is true for Taiwan. You know, once one party has been in power long enough, everybody just kind of wants something different, almost regardless of the performance of that particular party. Right. It's just about switching it up a little bit. Yeah,
I've heard the term rubber banding, specifically to talk about politics and like policies.
Oh yeah, that makes perfect sense.
It snaps back. Once you stretch it far enough, and that length is measured in like time usually, or sometimes progressiveness or conservativeness. Either way, when one party pushes really far in one direction, the instinct of that country is then to rubber band back or snap back to the opposite direction.
Taiwan is kind of seeing the same phenomenon where the DPP has stayed in charge for
also
longer than expected.
Insane. Crazy.
Yes, and yet we have Trump back in office. What's going on? Well,
the Trump effect actually might be to the credit of that.
That's true. That's true.
I think that's what you're about to say,
yes,
right?
Yeah. Actually, yeah. What's interesting about this is, let me just kind of give you the nitty-gritty of the election results.
Election stuff.
Yes, per an article for The Guardian by Archie Bland and Leyland Cecco, the election results indicate that Liberals will fall just short of a majority in the new government, remaining the leading party in a minority government, as it was in the last 2 elections.
That is still true. Like when the article was being written, the election was happening. As of now, the Liberal Party is 4 seats, just 4 seats short of a majority. Yeah, so they will have to form a coalition.
Pretty slim margin, though. This response is pretty heartening, I think, considering so many other right-wing populist-style leaders around the world have been relatively successful since Trump first rose to prominence in American politics. And Carney basically ran on being tough on Trump, promising to negotiate a new trade deal with the U.S. and reshuffling their trading partner priorities. Poilievre, on the other hand, basically hitched his wagon to Trump's MAGA movement, stopping just short of Trump's most radical positions on issues like immigration and small government, but otherwise aping their approach to culture war issues and trying to convince Canada that a friend of Trump would be in the best position to deal with him. I know Canada in particular is pretty incensed with America right now for good reason, and they have a pretty unique relationship in the world, so it's hard to imagine something like this going down in another country. But do you think politicians anywhere else could successfully run on an anti-Trump campaign?
Well, this is actually exactly why I wanted to talk to my friend about this, because like I said before, I only keep up with sort of very surface level of politics. So what I actually found interesting when I was talking to them is that this last election, I said was very polarized. From the United States, I obviously assumed the Liberal Party would be very liberal, but it's actually not really. It's a very centrist
more
party.
Center, isn't it?
So
yes.
In the last election, because I was asking, do you think that this is kind of a good thing or a bad thing? And granted, this is only talking to one person. But what she said was that actually in this election, there was a huge pull towards the center on both sides.
Interesting.
And that a lot of places like I said, there's 4 parties. There's the Conservative Party, the Liberal Party, the Bloc, which is usually from Quebec and is sort of center-left. And then there's the NDP or New Democratic Party, who is usually the most liberal party, usually, and then the Green Party. And oftentimes there is kind of a mix of all of those. There's not necessarily a stronger majority in one or the other. But actually a lot of places that used to be liberal or NDP or the Bloc switched and became conservative instead. And even places close to me in BC, which much like the United States often shares a more liberal leaning, actually flipped conservative for the first time. So a lot of, and even talking to my friend, and she was talking to some of her friends, it seems that a lot of people pulled to the center and voted strategically rather than for the party that they prefer.
There was a chart that I saw that showed the lines of depicting everyone's support, and I did see it's a big drop off for the NDP, and everyone just kind of agreed to support the Liberal Party so they could take this, basically.
That was it. Well, even that article you were talking about, the Guardian article, quoted that a lot of people, quote, didn't see the point in voting for an alternative party. They were so focused on making sure that the conservative, Polyev, didn't make it. And
just
actually,
stay out.
That,
right.
So to your original question of like, do I think that running anti-Trump would be a good policy for other countries? I'm not sure, because I think it's pretty unique. What I can say is it's definitely like in the Canadian elections, they called Polyev Trump light.
Yeah.
Because of that relationship that he had.
And that's what did him in.
Yeah. But it's actually not even the first time that Trump has affected elections in other countries. He's also often pointed to as the reason that the German elections did not go more conservative. I don't know if it would necessarily work in other places, but I think that for such a close relationship, in this case, it really worked. If you haven't, I would strongly recommend listening to, I've heard these clips over and over again this week. Who's the new guy? Mark Carney. From his speech. It's a very rousing pro-Canada speech that clearly shows how mad people are. He says,
Canada.
He's like, they want to take our land. They want to take our resources. But
It's
that will
true.
never happen. And you can hear people in the crowd like booing and like, yeah. Like it's clearly such an energizing force in North America, for sure.
Because they don't want to be the 51st state. What is that all about?
I honestly, like, an insane poll to me. I've said that word too many times. I'm going to try and avoid crazy and insane for the rest of this one podcast. Okay. But, like, I think it definitely works in North America because there are 3 very large countries and they have governed as friends for a very long time.
Exactly.
And to have blown that up is so opposite the long history that we have shared and seems so against the interest of at least the United States, but definitely in the very beginning, the United States and Canada. So Carney, who is a central banker, by trade.
He's a very measured sort of guy. Is everyone is kind of the way that he's been described is boring and safe.
I saw
and that's
bland
what they want,
and colorless.
Yeah.
But
bland and colorless.
You know what I also saw him say was that, which I found interesting. It was in the Guardian article. He said, I am somebody who is very good in a crisis, but I'm not good at peacetime.
I remember that also. He's the cleanup crew, I guess. He sees himself as such.
And I think he is. I think what is interesting is like he is somebody. I was listening to some other talking heads over at Pod Save the World, if anybody's interested. It's a good show.
I know this one,
Yeah. But they were discussing like something that is interesting from Carney is that since the United States and the Trump administration has bent on playing an economics game, they're now going to be bargaining with somebody who knows exactly what levers to pull. He was running the Bank of England for a very long time. So he's very savvy when it comes to making financial decisions. And I think that that is in the interest of Canada. I don't know if it would work for other countries because I think every country is going to be bringing its own unique situation in.
I think it's a good spot to lead into our next topic because the first order of affairs for Carney will be dealing with reciprocal tariffs. So let's take a quick break and we'll be right back with that. So the news on Trump's tariffs has been a lot of bluster and take-backsies, and it changes so quickly that it's hard to even talk about it on our program with any certainty that circumstances won't drastically change between the time we record and the time our episode airs. But one thing has held true for a while, and that's that he has stood pretty firm on the China tariff. Now, obviously, this is on the whole bad for business. To their credit, China is not backing down, and a closer look at the whole affair forecasts pretty catastrophic results for the United States. Stuart Churls, writing for the price reporting agency FreightWaves, which tracks data for the global supply chain, laid out just how many containerized imports American ports process in 2024, which came out to a total of 32,995,000 some odd tons. The sheer scope of China's share of all tonnage by commodity shows its dominance in categories like toys, household goods and personal care items, furniture, nuclear reactors, electronics, the list goes on. During this 90-day pause on reciprocal tariffs, everyone's making a mad dash to shift sourcing to countries in Southeast Asia and elsewhere. But according to supply chain expert Jason Miller from Michigan State University, there is, quote, no way that the U.S. can make up for the lost volumes from China and other countries due to the tariffs, and that local employment around the most affected ports is sure to be impacted, with knock-on effects that will drive down economic productivity in the area in general. It really makes me wonder, how long will these ripple effects from this be felt for the average American worker?
This is something that I did look into personally because, like I said, I'm from Seattle. That is a big port town.
It is. Yes, you're right.
The whole industry, not the whole industry, but one of the biggest industries, honestly, in my state is in shipping and freighting, because it's not just Seattle, it's other cities down the way like Tacoma. And earlier this week, it did turn out to be not entirely true, but there was a big scare going around social media of a photo showing the port totally empty.
Oh, God.
With nothing at all. Now,
it's not AI, right?
It's not AI. It is not entirely true, but it is already kind of having effects. And this is a more complicated issue when we look at the shipping, because I looked into this specifically. Now, it's not necessarily like when it gets to shipping freights, at least in my home, the photo wasn't true in terms of like the amount of ships coming in has actually increased. However, where we are already seeing effects from the tariffs is that the amount of cargo on each ship is very unpredictable.
I see.
So the ships themselves, like most of the ships from China, have stopped. The marine traffic is up. However, the cargo is sometimes up to 30% less than what they expect. And I got this from a Snopes article. If you were to look up Seattle shipping and Snopes, this is where you would find it as well. That has an immediate effect on the economy because the amount of people that they hire is based around cargo. And that's how much you have. So it's immediately felt by people like truckers, longshoremen, who are the people who help like get stuff off the boats, right? People who work in the harbor is mostly based on volume of cargo, not volume of ships. So it is immediately felt. There's also some like complication that this current kind of like lack of a drop might be because of everybody rushing to ship things ahead of the tariffs.
Right.
So we are
before
still,
the pause ends.
Right.
Yeah.
So by the time that we're recording this, those have already gone into effect. We're recording on the day that they're going into effect on May 2nd. But,
oh boy.
Yes. But some of the cargo that was shipped before that. And that has also been reflected in like the economy has lowered. The GDP lowered for like the first time in 3 years or something.
Oh, wow.
However, not as low as it may be because we are still seeing kind of not the bubble, but the surge of people rushing to beat the tariffs.
Right.
And so we'll have a better idea of what happens after, I guess, today going forward.
Can't wait.
Yeah. So how long will it last? We don't even know yet. We'll have to wait and see.
Yeah.
That's the worst news.
Yeah. I think there is maybe one silver lining to this whole tariff business, at least for me, and that's that 145% markup is bringing online shopping at Temu and Shein to a screeching halt. For those who don't know, Temu is kind of Chinese Amazon, I guess I could say, that is a lot less regulated, a lot cheaper, and generally just a lot crappier. Its competitor, Shein, is a similarly awful fast fashion garbage generator, and American customers are none too pleased about the price hikes on these sites. Gizmodo's Matt Novak explains that previously, Temu and Shein shipments valued under $800 USD were allowed to avoid tariffs under what was called the de minimis exemption. But Trump has said he's throwing that out. That's starting today. So Temu sellers are tacking that 145% tax right on. Shein, on the other hand, is coping by just pulling products rather than trying to sell them at a higher price. Meanwhile, Trump keeps lying about how he's talking to Chinese officials about negotiating a better deal. It's really funny.
That made me laugh so hard. He's like, we're talking, and then China's like, we've never received a phone call,
exactly.
and we won't talk.
What's crazy about this is China is usually the one pulling the deny and obfuscate card and using these other sort of tricks to force other countries to waste energy correcting them. So it's kind of incredible to see them have to come out and say, we didn't call him. We haven't met with him. No negotiations are taking place, So in any case, Americans really love their cheap crap from China. So I'm curious whether their inability to do these fashion hauls from Shein for their YouTube channel, then dump it all in a landfill, is going to change how anyone who might have otherwise been politically ambivalent will view this administration.
Something that I actually have been watching really closely is that de minimis thing. I remember seeing it pop up in February, I think it was Axios that was reporting on it, but now I couldn't even find the original post that I saw when they originally, very briefly, canceled de minimis for Canada and Mexico. And then they reinstated it, like what we were saying at the top of the show, that little like backsies, like,
yes,
nope, sorry, I didn't mean it. I didn't really mean it.
Just kidding.
Yeah, but I'm really curious mostly to see how that affects things, because the original idea of de minimis was that packages before the ceiling, I think, was $1,200. So the idea was that it costs more money to collect the tariff fee than they're actually receiving from the tariff fee. The idea that you're spending $1 to get a dime.
Okay.
Right? So that was why it was initially instigated. Now, of course, that's not the case anymore. It has, as of our recording day, and by the time that you're listening to this, been canceled, at least for all products coming through China. And so looking forward, how this could affect people, like I said, this did actually already happen. So we could, though it's not necessarily a one-to-one, we could look at what happened when this happened in February with the de minimis cancellation between Canada and Mexico. Reporting for PBS, they said that in early February, when Trump canceled the 2-day exemption, like he had a suspension of the de minimis, something like 1 million packages piled up at JFK.
It's a logistical nightmare.
Yeah. So is it going to be the same for China? I don't know. It's hard to tell. But as per CNN, reporting on the 25th here, they were saying that following the cancellation, so from now onward, businesses, not individuals necessarily, but at least businesses will either have to pay a 120% tariff or a flat $100 fee per postal item.
Phew.
And come June 1st, the flat fee will increase to $200.
It's inconceivable. I've already seen a couple of small creators basically have to shutter, their doors because they simply cannot do business between these huge tariffs and all of these fees slapped on everything.
Well, so much manufacturing is done in China, right? And so much American manufacturing, which I know they're kind of trying to force to the United States. But the first people who are going to be cut out by this are small businesses and, honestly, the poorest households in the United States.
Because, as always the case?
Yeah. As statistics show, most of the people, or the people rather who spend the most money on these sites, specifically Shein and Temu, usually belong to the lowest income brackets in the U.S.
Right.
So I guess that's sort of the pattern in the United States, but that's who it's going to hurt first.
I think it's interesting that obviously Temu and Shein are not within the United States jurisdiction. These are Chinese sites. So Trump has no oversight. He can't do anything about them. Amazon, on the other hand, was quick to kowtow to the White House when accused of politicizing the tariffs by floating the idea of displaying import charges on items sold on their site. Just floating the idea, mind you, not actually doing it. It primarily would have affected items sold on Haul, their answer to Temu, which I didn't know existed, and which I'm horrified to know exists, which they launched last year so they could further contribute to flooding the world with trash. CNBC reporter Annie Palmer explained the back and forth, saying that after a report was released about Amazon's plans, they didn't do anything, remember, it's just plans, the White House fired back, calling it a, quote, hostile and political act. How dare you brand your products, basically, with a Trump tax, even though that's exactly what it
tax
is.
Right now it is the Trump tax. Like, everyone is a Trump tax. That's what they levied on the world.
Right. What is it? Gaslight, girl boss. What's the other
Gatekeep.
word? Gatekeep.
Gatekeep, gaslight, girl boss.
That's right. Gatekeep, gaslight, girl boss. That's the White House's MO now, I guess.
Yeah, gaslight especially. But I was watching, I remember the day that came out, a reporter asks, it's at, there's a video of House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt kind of cutting in this like White House briefing, cutting across the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, to say like, oh, I'll cover this because I just got off a call with Trump who was talking about the subject, where she then like says that this is a hostile and political act and is very against it. She's like, this was a terrible idea. Trump allegedly called Jeff Bezos. This sort of gets back to our last story about a lot of these guys really wanting to please the White House.
Yeah, there's no direct in his pocket.
There's no direct line. What I did find interesting was one of the daily news things that I was listening to pointed out that he is no longer the CEO of Amazon. He stepped down a few years ago. So
why are we always talking about him then?
So, well, I think he still owns it. But he's not the CEO.
He is the Amazon guy.
Yeah, he's the Amazon guy. But So he called him and then it was immediately canceled. As you said, this wasn't even official policy. This was something that actually even before the tariffs themselves, or before the tariffs were officially levied, as the story goes, that Amazon Hall was considering doing. So it must have been very easy for them to cancel. But that was kind of like a whole one-day problem.
Yeah, nothing even happened. It's just this report kind of snuck out.
Fast news.
And then the White House and Trump got their britches in a twist about it, because nothing had happened, but they knew, of course, it was going to be bad optics. That's really what it's all about, is the optics.
Well, because their whole point, like this is almost the same playbook as like the first Trump administration, when they were like insisting that the United States will not pay to build a wall between Mexico and the U.S., but Mexico will pay it. So the reason why they do not want American consumers to know, they don't want any transparency on how much money this is going to cost the American consumer, is because that's exactly what they've been saying, that like Americans will not pay the cost of tariffs. But that just doesn't make any sense. That exists in a bubble where the United States is only getting its own items, and that doesn't exist. That economy doesn't exist.
Right.
And as you were saying earlier, even as they like scramble to try to find manufacturers in other countries, that involves reworking supply chains that have been in effect at least for 10 years.
Yeah.
Right? Or more. So it's not easy to relocate every supply chain in the United States. Is it every supply chain? No. But a lot of the supply chains, even not necessarily to China, because everybody is now trying to deal with the cost of these tariffs. And the person who is going to end up paying for it is the U.S. To tie that all back to this Amazon story, like that was one reason why before it could even happen, almost as soon as it was suggested, they cut in and they were like, don't do that. This is hostile. This is political. Of course it's political. We're talking about how much money people have to spend to get stuff from other countries. It's always going to be political.
That's right. In any case, I'm afraid we've got more than, I think I calculated this, 1,300 some odd days of Trump to go, unless something happens. I don't know. I'm not suggesting anything, but if life is as boring as it normally is, we've got 1,360-ish days of Trump left. So it remains to be seen how things will shake down. Well, that's it for today's news report. I'm Hannah Belinsky.
And I'm Amanda Stevens.
Thanks for joining us today. Tune in tomorrow for more programs by Radio Taiwan International. And in the meantime, remember to stop scrolling and touch grass. We'll see you next week.
Bye.